Story number 1.
The snow had been falling relentlessly since late afternoon. By the time the evening rolled around, the world had turned into a blank canvas of white. The cold seeped into my bones, and the wind howled through the trees, making the night feel even darker and more oppressive than it already was. I was driving home after a long day at work, and the roads were deserted, just me, the headlights, and the thick blanket of snow. I lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, had a place surrounded by fields and forests. The drive was long, and although I was used to the isolation, tonight it felt different. The emptiness seemed more oppressive, the silence more pronounced. It was the kind of night that made you feel as if something was lurking just beyond the reach of your vision, waiting to spring forward. As I turned onto the familiar road that led to my house, the snow intensified. The flakes grew larger, swirling around in the gusts of wind. I slowed down, my headlights barely cutting through the storm. The trees lining the road appeared as dark shapes against the white backdrop, their branches swaying eerily in the wind. I was nearly home when I saw it, just up ahead, by the side of the road. A figure. A person standing in the snow. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone out here. The road was remote, and there were no houses for miles. I squinted, trying to make out the shape, but the snow was so thick that it was difficult to tell. The person stood motionless, barely visible in the storm. I slowed the car, the tires crunching on the snow, as I brought it to a stop a few feet away. I rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you all right?" There was no response. I glanced around nervously. The only sound was the howling wind and the soft hiss of the snow against the car. My breath fogged up the windshield as I tried to peer through the swirling snow to get a better look. The figure remained still. It was unsettling, something about the unnatural quiet, the stillness of the figure that didn't match the storm. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. Still no response. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to drive away. It was late, and this road wasn't safe, especially with the snow picking up like it was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't leave someone stranded out here. I opened the car door, the cold hitting me immediately. My boots crunched through the thick snow as I stepped out, my breath turning to vapor in front of me. I took a few steps forward, cautiously approaching the figure. As I got closer, the first thing I noticed was the woman's clothing. She was wearing a long, dark coat, and her hair was dark, hanging loosely around her shoulders. She wasn't facing me. She was turned toward the trees, her back to me. I could barely see her face beneath the hood, but there was something about the way she stood, still unmoving, that made my skin crawl. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The woman didn't respond. She remained perfectly still, staring at the trees. I was starting to feel the first stirrings of panic now. There was no reason for anyone to be out here in the storm, much less standing motionless, facing the trees. My instincts told me to turn back, but I couldn't leave her like this. I took another step toward her, but as I did, something in the back of my mind started screaming at me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was horribly wrong. My legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath me was pulling me downward. "Hello?" I called again, a little more urgently this time. My voice was shaking, and I forced myself to step closer to her, but my feet felt like they were stuck in the snow. And then she moved. At first, it was just the slightest shift, the faintest tilt of her head. But then, as if it had been rehearsed, her head turned slowly toward me. I froze. Her eyes were dark. So dark, they seemed to absorb the light around them. No pupils, no irises, just an endless, black void. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from hers. It was as if she was pulling me in, like there was something inside her eyes, something I wasn't supposed to see, but was being forced to look at. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were frozen. My mind was screaming at me to get away, but I couldn't move. For what felt like an eternity, she just stared at me, her eyes empty, her face unreadable. There was no emotion, no recognition, nothing human about her. I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a deep, dark abyss, and if I took one more step, I might fall into it. The air around us grew colder, almost unbearably so. I could see my breath now, forming clouds in the air. The snow had stopped falling for a moment, and there was a deep, unnatural silence that swallowed everything. The wind had died down completely, and then the woman opened her mouth. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, from somewhere deep within her chest, a voice emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice. It was more of a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo in my mind rather than my ears. Leave. It was a single word, but the way it vibrated through me, it felt like a warning. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The feeling of dread that had been building up inside me reached its peak. I stumbled backward, my legs finally responding, but my eyes never left her. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to the car. I could feel the presence of her eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look back. I reached the car, fumbled for the keys, and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands shook violently as I started the engine and sped away, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror. But there was nothing there. No woman. No figure. The road was empty. Silent. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze. The image of her eyes burned into my mind. I couldn't explain what had happened. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I had seen her. There was no doubt about it. But what had she been? And why had she been out there alone in the snow in the dead of night? I never spoke of it to anyone. Who would believe me? A woman in the snow with eyes as black as the void. No, I couldn't explain it. But every time I drove that road in the future, every time I passed that spot, I could feel her presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. And I knew, deep down, that whatever it was, it had been real. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The cold of winter had settled in hard that year, with snow falling relentlessly for days on end. The roads were icy, and the small town I lived in seemed to be swallowed up by the storms. My house was isolated, situated just outside of town, nestled between the woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was a certain solitude in living so far from the center of things, but it was a solitude I was used to. That night, however, something felt different. I had been driving home late from work, the clock long past midnight. The highway was mostly empty, the occasional car passing by in the opposite direction. The headlights of my own car cut through the thick darkness, illuminating the snow-covered road ahead. The wind howled, battering against the sides of the car as I made my way home. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. When I approached the curve in the road near the woods, I saw something strange, a figure standing in the middle of the road just up ahead. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snow, maybe a shadow cast by the bare trees. But as I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman. At least I thought it was. She stood motionless in the middle of the road, her back to me. The snow swirled around her, but she didn't move, didn't seem to react to the howling wind or the cold. I slowed the car, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out as I rolled down the window. The woman didn't turn, didn't move a muscle. "Are you okay?" I asked again, my voice shaky now. Something about her stillness was unnerving. The wind howled louder, but there was no response. The woman didn't even glance in my direction. I couldn't see her face. Her dark hair was pulled into a long, tangled mess that covered most of it. She wore a coat, though I couldn't tell the color in the poor light. I thought about driving around her, but something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. What if she was hurt, lost in this storm? What if she needed help? I couldn't just leave her out here, especially not with how bad the conditions were. I stopped the car, heart racing. My hand hovered over the door handle, but something kept me from stepping out immediately. The cold was biting, the air thick with snow. The longer I stared at her, the more I began to feel that there was something wrong about the situation, something I couldn't quite place. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the car door and stepped out into the snow. The cold hit me hard, and my boots sank a few inches into the thick blanket of snow as I walked toward her. The snow was falling heavier now, swirling around me in gusts that made it hard to see clearly. "Excuse me," I said as I approached. My voice was louder now, trying to reach her over the wind. "Are you all right?" She still didn't move. I was only a few feet away from her now, and I could feel a strange tension building in the air, like something was about to snap. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the car, but I pressed forward, compelled by some strange sense of duty. I had to make sure she was all right. I had to help her. But then something happened that froze me in place. She turned. Slowly, her head moved toward me, and I could feel my blood run cold as her faces came into view. Her eyes, there was something wrong with them. They were wide open, dark and empty, like black holes that consumed all the light around them. They were so deep, so unblinking, that I felt myself drawn into them, unable to look away. It was as if she wasn't really there, as if she was nothing more than an echo, a shadow that had taken form. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might disturb the eerie silence that had settled around us. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath visible in the freezing air. She didn't respond. Instead, she simply stared, her gaze unblinking, unfeeling. Her mouth remained slightly open, but there was no movement. I felt as though I were speaking to a ghost, a figure trapped between two worlds. "Do you need help?" I asked again, but this time something in my voice cracked. The words felt hollow, like they didn't matter, like they were lost in the void of her presence. Her eyes didn't waver. She didn't blink, didn't speak. It was as though she was waiting for something. Or perhaps it was me who was waiting. For what, though? I wasn't sure. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, stronger this time, and I was snapped out of my daze. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get in the car and drive away. But my body didn't respond. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the icy grip of her gaze. Without warning, she took a step toward me. The movement was so sudden, so unnatural that I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. She was coming closer, her feet barely touching the ground as if she were floating just above it. The snow around her seemed to swirl in impossible patterns, as if bending around her form, refusing to settle. A jolt of panic surged through me, and I turned, bolting for the car. My legs felt like lead, my feet heavy in the snow, but somehow I managed to push myself forward. I reached the door, yanked it open, and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking, but I finally managed to start the engine. I didn't look back. My car slid and slid in the snow, the tires struggling for traction, but I kept my foot on the gas. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged in the freezing air. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me from the road, but there was nothing. The road behind me was empty, as silent as it had been before. I drove the rest of the way home without incident, but the unease never left me. Every crack in the snow outside my window, every gust of wind that rattled the trees, made me feel as though she were still out there, waiting, watching. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? A woman standing in the snow, staring at me with eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them. I tried to push it out of my mind, to convince myself it had all been some sort of hallucination, a trick of the storm. But every time I drove that stretch of road again, every time I passed the woods, I couldn't help but wonder, what if she was real? What if she had been there for a reason? And what if she was still waiting? Story the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the trees that night, a piercing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The snow had started to fall around late afternoon and hadn't stopped since. By the time the clock struck midnight, it was as if the world outside my home had vanished completely beneath a thick blanket of white. The kind of snow that shuts everything down, leaving you with nothing but silence. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, nestled near a forest where the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. I was used to the quiet, but tonight the stillness felt different, unnatural. The wind rattled the windows and the trees groaned under the weight of the snow. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with a book in my lap, trying to lose myself in the pages, but the noise outside made it impossible to concentrate. There was something in the air, something I couldn't quite place. A heaviness. It was almost like the entire world was holding its breath. Around 1 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow outside. At first, I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone walking slowly through the snow, right outside my window. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and walked to the window, my breath fogging up the glass. I peered outside, squinting against the wind and the falling snow, but there was nothing there. The yard was empty, covered in undisturbed snow. I frowned, puzzled, and turned away, shaking my head as though to dismiss the thought. But then it came again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. This time, the sound was closer, just outside my door. I froze. I had no idea who would be out there in this kind of weather, especially this late at night. My first thought was that it could be a lost traveler, someone who had gotten lost in the storm, but then I remembered that the nearest road was over a mile away. No one would be out here. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked cautiously to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened the door slowly, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The porch was empty, nothing but snow and the soft hum of the wind. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I was about to close the door when something caught my eye. A figure, tall, shrouded in shadow, standing just at the edge of the tree line. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, motionless, facing me. My throat tightened, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. I called out, but my voice faltered in the cold air. "Hello?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Is someone out there?" There was no response, just the stillness. I waited a moment longer, but the figure didn't move, didn't speak. I felt a sudden urge to retreat back into the house, but my legs wouldn't move. Something about that shadow, something about the way it stood so perfectly still, made me feel as though it was waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I rushed back inside and locked the door behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't know what to think. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. People didn't wander through the woods in the middle of a snowstorm at that hour. And yet, I had seen it, felt it. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Every sound, every creak of the house seemed louder than it should have been. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I fell asleep on the couch, the light still on. The next morning, I woke up with a start, my heart still racing. I rubbed my eyes and looked around the room. The house was eerily quiet, but there was a deep sense of unease that lingered in the air. I grabbed my coat and boots and went outside, desperate to see if there were any footprints in the snow, anything that might explain what I'd seen the night before. I walked around the house, scanning the ground carefully. The snow had been untouched when I opened the door, but as I moved toward the tree line, I saw them. Footprints. Large, deep prints in the snow, leading away from the house and toward the trees. I followed them, my breath coming out in quick bursts as I trudged through the snow. The prints led deeper into the woods, far beyond where I'd seen the figure the night before. They didn't look like the tracks of any animal I knew, nor did they seem to belong to a person. They were large, almost unnaturally so, and the way they were spaced apart made it seem as though whatever made them had been moving quickly and deliberately. I continued to follow the tracks, my curiosity outweighing the growing sense of dread that filled me. The snow between the trees was still and untouched, as if nothing had been disturbed for years. The deeper I went, the darker it became, the trees pressing in around me, and then I heard it. A sound, faint at first but unmistakable. Footsteps, crunching through the snow slowly, deliberately, just like the night before. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as the sound grew louder, closer. I spun around, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the wind had died down, and the snow was falling in soft, steady flakes. I felt a presence, though, something cold, something watching. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned and hurried back toward the house, but the footsteps followed me, growing closer with each step I took. I reached the edge of the woods and ran the rest of the way back to my door, slamming it behind me. I leaned against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps had stopped. I listened carefully, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind against the house. I don't know what happened that night or what I saw, but I know what I felt. Something was out there in the woods, and it wasn't human. It didn't belong to this world. It had been watching me. I haven't gone back to that part of the woods since. The snow has melted, the trees have lost their leaves, but that feeling lingers. The house feels quieter now, emptier somehow. I can still hear the footsteps, echoing through the night. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The winter night had settled thick over the town, blanketing everything in a cold, unyielding silence. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, coating the streets and rooftops with a layer of white. The wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the narrow alleyways. It was the kind of night that made you want to stay inside, curled up in front of a fire, safe and warm. But for me, there was no such luxury. I had to work late at the small family-run diner on the outskirts of town. The last few customers had trickled out, their cars leaving long tire tracks in the snow as they drove off into the night. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally locked up and headed outside, my breath visible in the frigid air. I lived just a few blocks away, a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town. The walk back home was always eerie at this hour, the streetlights casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. The town was small, and most people had already gone to bed. All that was left was the wind and the occasional rustle of a branch against a window. As I walked down the quiet street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a rational fear, just a nagging sense of unease that had settled over me ever since I'd moved into the apartment a few months earlier. The building was old, at least 100 years, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of every step. The landlord had warned me that the pipes made strange noises, but he never mentioned anything about the apartment's unsettling history. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts out of my mind. It was probably just my imagination, a byproduct of being awake too long. But then I heard it. A faint sound, just barely audible over the wind. A voice, soft, almost like a whisper. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to listen. There was nothing but the wind at first, the branches swaying in the trees. But then the voice came again, louder this time, more distinct. Help. It wasn't a shout or a scream, just a weak, pleading whisper that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of me. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around, but the street was empty. No one was around. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should investigate. It wasn't uncommon for people to get into trouble in the snow, especially if they were drunk or had slipped on the ice. But something about the voice unsettled me. There was no panic in it, no urgency, just a quiet, desperate tone. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind. Maybe someone was calling out from one of the nearby houses, or I was hearing things. But then, as if to confirm my suspicion, the voice came again. Help me. This time it was louder, more insistent. The sound seemed to come from an alley just off the main road. I had never noticed it before, but in the silence of the night, it felt like it was calling directly to me. Something in my gut told me I had to check it out. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the alley and began walking slowly toward it. The snow crunched under my boots and the wind howled in my ears. As I neared the mouth of the alley, the voice became clearer, the words chilling in their simplicity. Help me. I was almost to the end of the alley when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the shadow of a dumpster or a stray piece of debris. But then I saw the shape again, this time more distinct, a figure. It was standing at the end of the alley, just a few feet away. I could barely make out its features in the dim light, but it was clearly a person. A man, his face hidden in the darkness. His body was hunched, his arms dangling limply at his sides. The voice came again, this time from his direction. Help me. I froze. My heart raced in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The man didn't move, didn't seem to react to my presence at all. It was as if he was trapped in the same spot, frozen in time. I wanted to call out to him, to ask if he was okay, but the words wouldn't come. There was something about the way he stood, motionless, his head tilted slightly to the side, that made me uneasy. He didn't seem to be real. Suddenly, he shifted. I gasped, taking a step back as his head jerked toward me. His eyes were wide, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. They were cold, empty. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stared back at him, paralyzed by fear. There was something in those eyes, something hollow, something lifeless. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the wind, whipping through the alley and rustling the branches overhead. Then, slowly, the man opened his mouth. Help me. This time, the voice was distorted, unnatural. It wasn't the voice of a living person. It was something else. something that sent a wave of terror through me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted back toward the street. The snow flew up around me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my apartment building, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. I stood there for a long moment, my back pressed against the door, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking, and I could still hear the echo of that distorted voice in my head. But when I turned to face the apartment, everything seemed normal. The lights were on, the room was warm. There was no sign of the figure, no indication that anything had happened. It was just me, standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I had been tired, that I had imagined it. But when I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing the faintest sound, a whisper carried on the wind, a voice calling from the darkness. Help me. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I went to work as usual, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen in the alley. I had asked around town, but no one had heard of any strange disappearances or incidents. The man in the alley remained a mystery, just like the voice. And though I tried to forget about it, I couldn't. Every winter night, when the snow falls and the wind howls through the streets, I still hear it. The voice, faint and distant, calling to me from the darkness. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the coldest winter night I could remember. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The temperature had dropped below zero, and the wind carried a sharp sting that cut right through my jacket. I had been working late at the small convenience store on the edge of town, the kind of place that never had much traffic at this time of night. The town was sleepy, and the roads were empty, covered in a sheet of ice. By the time I locked up and stepped outside, it was well past midnight. I had to walk about a mile to get to my apartment, tucked away in an old building that had seen better days. It was always quiet at this hour, with the only sound coming from the wind rustling through the trees and the crunch of snow beneath my boots. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and started my walk, eager to get home and out of the freezing cold. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice how eerily still the night felt. The streets were completely empty, not a single car in sight. The snow muffled any sound, leaving the world feeling hushed and abandoned. It was the kind of night where the air felt heavy, almost as if it was pressing down on everything. I passed by the old church on the corner, its dark silhouette barely visible through the falling snow. I always thought the church looked haunting at night, its towering steeple casting long shadows on the ground. There was a graveyard behind it, though I rarely thought about it. People in town said it was haunted, but I never put much stock into ghost stories. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was something about the air that felt off. Maybe it was the isolation of the empty streets, or the way the wind howled through the trees like it was trying to tell me something. I shook off the feeling and pressed on. As I passed the church, I heard it, a faint sound like a soft whisper carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, muffled but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the graveyard. Help me. The voice was soft, like a plea for help, but it didn't sound human. It sounded distant, almost like it was coming from somewhere far away. I stopped in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My first instinct was to ignore it, to keep walking and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something about the voice made my heart race, and I found myself turning toward the graveyard. The snow was falling harder now, the wind whipping through the trees, making it difficult to see. But I could just make out the outline of the gravestones in the distance. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp on the other side of the street. The graveyard was silent, except for the whispering wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should investigate or just keep walking. I knew I should ignore it. There was no reason to go poking around a graveyard at this hour. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself walking toward the entrance. The gate was old, rusted, and barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open slowly, the screech of the metal making me wince. The air felt colder now, the temperature dropping even further as I stepped into the graveyard. The snow was thick on the ground, and the gravestones loomed around me, their surfaces weathered and cracked from years of exposure. I took a few steps forward, my breath visible in the freezing air. There was no sound now, just the crunch of snow beneath my boots and the distant howl of the wind. And then I heard it again. "Help me." The voice was clearer now, louder. It wasn't coming from far away, it was close, right in front of me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I call out? The voice seemed to be coming from the direction of an old tombstone up ahead, half buried in snow. I could barely make it out in the darkness, but something about it seemed wrong. It was as if it had been placed there recently, though I knew it had been there for years. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes fixed on the tombstone. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The snow around the stone was disturbed, like someone or something had been moving around it. The ground looked freshly disturbed, and there were footprints in the snow leading up to the stone. I reached the tombstone and stopped. The name engraved on it was faint, but I could make out the word Miller, followed by a date. I brushed the snow off the surface, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a new grave, but it was strange that the snow had been disturbed in such a way. It was almost as if someone had been digging around it. And then I saw it. A hand. A pale, bony hand emerging from the snow beside the tombstone. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The hand was not real, not in the way I had hoped. It was translucent, like it was made of smoke or mist. It twisted in unnatural angles, as if it was trying to claw its way out of the ground. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The voice came again, but this time it was different. The words were clearer, and there was a pleading, desperate tone in it. "Help me. Please." I turned and ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't even think, I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my feet slipping on the icy ground. The snow was falling so thickly now that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I heard the sound of something following me, dragging itself through the snow, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the gate and pushed it open, stumbling out of the graveyard and back onto the street. I kept running until I reached my apartment building, my legs aching from the effort, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, the door slamming shut behind me. I couldn't explain what I had seen in that graveyard. The hand, the voice. It didn't make sense. I was too terrified to go back to even think about what had happened. But as I sat in my apartment staring out the window at the snowstorm outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something that had been buried in that graveyard, waiting to be heard. And every winter night since, when the snow begins to fall and the wind picks up, I hear it again. A soft whisper on the wind, a voice calling out from the darkness. "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 6.
The night the snowstorm hit, I was driving home from a late shift at the diner. It was just past midnight, and the roads were slick with ice, the visibility next to nothing. I had taken the same route home for years, the winding, snow-covered path through the woods on the outskirts of town. Normally, the drive was peaceful, quiet, even beautiful on nights like this, when the snow clung to the trees in heavy, thick layers. But tonight felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air that made my skin crawl. I had just passed the old cemetery on the edge of town when the storm really started to pick up. The wind howled through the trees, the snow now swirling in thick, blinding sheets. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to navigate the treacherous road. The headlights cut through the snow like a dull knife, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. Suddenly, my car jolted, the tires skidding out of control on the icy road. I slammed my foot on the brake, but it was no use. The car slid sideways, sending me into the ditch by the side of the road. My heart pounded as I tried to steady myself, but the snow was falling faster now, covering the windshield, blurring my vision. I sat there for a moment, stunned, before I turned off the engine and grabbed my phone. There was no signal. I cursed under my breath. Of course, I had no signal. The roads were deserted this time of night, and even more so when the storm rolled in like this. I was alone, completely alone. I grabbed my coat from the passenger seat, threw it on, and opened the door. The cold hit me like a wall, biting into my skin instantly. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the snow swirling around me, covering the ground in a thick white blanket. I took a few steps toward the road, hoping to flag down someone, but there was no one. No other cars, no lights, just the darkness of the woods and the relentless snowstorm. I started walking in the direction of the nearest town, hoping to find some shelter, but the wind was fierce, cutting through my coat. I had no choice but to push on. The snow was up to my knees now, and each step felt heavier than the last. I could hear the storm roaring above me, but there was something else. Something beneath the howl of the wind. A sound. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I paused, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, faint but unmistakable. I turned around, scanning the darkness behind me. Nothing, just the swirling snow, the thick veil of white that seemed to consume everything around me. The voice came again, this time clearer. Help me. My blood ran cold. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was no one out here, no one but me. Help me. The voice was closer this time, almost as if it was right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing, just the snow and the wind. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. I had to keep moving. I had no other choice. The town wasn't far now. I could make it. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep walking, pushing through the snow, trying to ignore the voice. But it kept coming, growing louder, more urgent, more desperate. Help me. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a voice. There was something else in it. A sound. A scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. The hairs on my arms prickled as I realized that the sound wasn't coming from the direction I was walking. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around again, heart pounding in my chest. There was something there now. I could see it. A figure, standing in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. The figure was tall, hunched over slightly, but I couldn't make out its features. Just a dark silhouette, standing perfectly still. The air grew colder and my breath caught in my throat. I knew I should run. I knew I should get out of there, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like some unseen force was holding me in place. The figure moved. Slowly, cautiously, it started toward me. Its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it were struggling against something. The scraping noise grew louder, more distinct. It was like nails on a chalkboard, sending a shiver down my spine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure. It grew closer, the scraping now so loud it felt like it was inside my head. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, but my body refused to move. My legs were frozen, my body a statue in the snow. The figure was only a few feet away now, its face still obscured by the swirling snow. The air around it seemed to grow colder, and I could see my breath in the air, misting in front of me. The figure stopped just in front of me, and for a moment everything was still. The wind had died down, and the snow stopped falling, leaving only the eerie silence. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was not like the whispering from before. It was deep, guttural, like the voice of something not quite human. You shouldn't have come. The words sent a chill through my entire body, colder than the storm ever could. I felt my legs finally give way, and I collapsed to the snow. The figure seemed to loom over me, its form shifting, darkening, like it was becoming part of the night itself. You shouldn't have come, it repeated, the voice growing harsher. It was so close now that I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The wind howled back to life, the snow resumed falling, and the air grew unbearably cold once more. I was left alone in the storm, heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. I didn't know how long I sat there, trying to gather the strength to get up, to move. But eventually, my legs obeyed and I stumbled to my feet. The road was empty. The storm had swallowed everything. I had no idea where the figure had gone, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I stumbled forward, my legs numb, my body shaking from the cold and fear. The town was close now, I knew it was. I could make it. I just had to keep moving. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I saw the lights of the town in the distance, a beacon through the storm. I pushed myself harder, my feet dragging through the deep snow until I finally made it to the safety of the town. But as I collapsed into the warmth of a nearby diner, I realized something. Something I hadn't noticed before. There were marks on the back of my hands, deep, dark scratches as if something had dug into my skin. I didn't go back to the woods. I never drove that road again. And I never spoke of what happened that night to anyone. But sometimes when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the voice. And I know, deep down, it will never let me forget. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wind howled across the frozen landscape, its icy tendrils finding their way into every crack and crevice. The small town of Frosthaven lay blanketed in snow, the kind that muffled the world and seemed to absorb every sound except the wind. On this particular winter night, a storm was brewing, the sky heavy with dark clouds pregnant with more snow. Mara had just finished her shift at the diner and was walking home. The streets were deserted, the town's Christmas lights flickering like weak beacons in the cold. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, her breath forming clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. Her house was at the edge of town, close to the woods, and she usually enjoyed the peace of the walk, but tonight felt different. The unease began when she passed the old church. It had been abandoned for decades, its wooden structure leaning precariously to one side. The locals claimed it was haunted, but no one had any concrete stories, just whispers about strange lights and shadows that didn't belong. As Mara hurried past, she thought she saw movement in one of the broken windows. She stopped and squinted, but the dim streetlights revealed nothing. Shaking off her nerves, she continued, her boots crunching in the snow. As she neared the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Mara glanced behind her but saw only her tracks in the snow, leading back into the glow of the town. Ahead, the woods loomed, dark and foreboding. The path to her house cut straight through them, a shortcut she had taken countless times. She hesitated, her gut telling her to take the long way around. But the storm was intensifying, and the cold was biting deeper with every minute she lingered. She stepped onto the path. The snow in the woods was undisturbed, pristine and untouched. The trees creaked under the weight of the ice, their bare branches rattling in the wind like skeletal fingers. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the silence. Halfway through, she stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard something. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable. A whisper. Mara turned in a slow circle, scanning the shadows between the trees. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time, but she couldn't make out the words. It was like the sound of dry leaves brushing together, soft and insistent. Panic set in, and she began to walk faster, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the path ahead. It was cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct, but she could see the outline of a head and shoulders. Mara froze. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. The whispering grew louder, swirling around her like the wind, but it didn't come from the figure. It was all around her, a chorus of voices just beyond comprehension. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figure raised an arm, pointing at her. Its hand was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, the fingers unnaturally long. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "Leave." Mara didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, the snow grabbing at her boots as if trying to hold her back. The path twisted and turned, but she didn't look back. The voices returned, louder now, shouting incomprehensible words that seemed to pierce her skull. She stumbled, falling face first into the snow, but she scrambled to her feet and kept running. When she finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing where her house stood, she didn't stop until she was inside, the door slamming shut behind her. She locked it and leaned against it, her chest heaving. The house was dark and silent, but it felt safe, a sanctuary against whatever was out there. She stayed by the door for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of pursuit. When none came, she finally allowed herself to move. She turned on every light in the house, the warm glow banishing the shadows, but the unease didn't leave her. She checked the windows, peering out into the night, but the woods were still, the snow reflecting the faint moonlight. Mara decided to make herself a cup of tea to calm her nerves. As she stood by the kitchen counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, she heard it again, the whispering. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the water heating, but it was there. She turned slowly, her heart sinking. The whispering was coming from inside the house. She grabbed a knife from the counter and crept through the rooms, her eyes darting to every shadow. The whispering grew louder as she reached the living room, where the large picture window looked out over the woods. The curtains were open, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement outside. She stepped closer, the knife shaking in her hand. The whispering stopped, replaced by a single, clear word spoken in that same deep voice. Mine. The glass of the window shattered, and Mara screamed, falling back as a rush of icy air filled the room. She looked up, expecting to see the figure from the woods, but the room was empty. The snow outside was untouched, no sign of anyone having been there, but the whispers remained, a constant chilling presence that would follow her for the rest of her life. Story: the end.
Story number 8.
It was a bitterly cold winter night in January when I first arrived at the cabin. The snow fell in heavy, silent drifts, muffling the world around me. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was my retreat from the chaos of city life, a place where I could focus on writing my long-overdue novel. The landlord, a gruff man named Henry, had warned me about the isolation. No cell service, no internet. The storm might cut the power, too, he had said, his dark eyes flicking toward the snow-laden forest. Some folks can't handle it out here. I assured him I could. I needed the solitude, craved the stillness. As I stepped into the small, cozy cabin, the warmth of the fireplace greeted me, and I quickly unpacked my things. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I found the sound oddly comforting. I settled in, tapping away at my laptop. Hours slipped by, and soon the clock struck midnight. That's when I heard it. A soft knock at the front door. I froze. Who would be out here at this hour in such a storm? For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, 3 deliberate knocks. I approached the door cautiously, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but swirling snow. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack. No one was there. A cold gust of wind swept inside, and I quickly shut the door, bolting it. My heart pounded as I turned to my desk, trying to rationalize the sound. Perhaps it was a branch striking the door. Yes, that had to be it. I shook off the unease and resumed typing, but my focus was broken. An hour later, the knocking returned. This time it wasn't at the door. It came from the window. I turned, my stomach tightening. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the window was closed. Summoning my courage, I approached the window and pulled the curtains aside. Outside, in the pale glow of the moonlight, stood a figure, a woman, her long black hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She wore a thin white gown, utterly out of place in the freezing weather. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were a deep, unnatural blue. She stared at me, unblinking. Her eyes were dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. When I dared to look again, she was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light or my overactive imagination, but the unease lingered. The cabin felt colder, the shadows deeper. I lit more logs in the fireplace, but the chill persisted, seeping into my bones. The power went out shortly after. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam slicing through the gloom. The wind outside had picked up, wailing like a mournful cry. And then, amidst the storm's howl, I heard it. A voice. Help me. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The voice came again, clearer this time, and closer. Please, help me. It seemed to emanate from the woods, beckoning me. Against all logic, I grabbed my coat and boots, stepping outside into the freezing night. The snow crunched underfoot as I followed the voice, my flashlight illuminating a narrow path through the trees. The forest was eerily silent except for the wind. The voice grew fainter, leading me deeper into the woods. I called out, my breath visible in the frigid air. Who's there? Do you need help? No response. I stopped, realizing how far I had wandered. The cabin's lights were no longer visible, and the storm had obscured my footprints. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Then I saw her again, the woman in white. She stood a few feet away, her hair whipping around her face in the wind. She raised a hand, pointing to something behind me. I turned, and my flashlight illuminated a small, snow-covered grave. The headstone was weathered, the name and date barely legible. But I could make out enough: Eliza, and the year, 1893. When I turned back, the woman was gone. The wind howled louder, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. I ran blindly through the snow, but my flashlight flickering. The trees seemed to close in around me, their skeletal branches clawing at my jacket. I stumbled, falling face first into the snow. When I looked up, I saw the cabin. Relief washed over me as I scrambled to my feet, rushing toward the door. Once inside, I bolted it shut and collapsed by the fire, shivering. I didn't sleep that night. The woman's image haunted me, her dark eyes and blue lips etched into my mind. When dawn broke, I decided to leave. The storm had passed, and the road was barely visible beneath the snow, but I couldn't stay another moment. As I packed my belongings, I found a photograph tucked inside one of the drawers. It was old, the edges frayed. The image showed a family standing in front of the cabin, a man, a woman, and a young girl. The woman's face was unmistakable. It was her. I left the cabin, my heart racing. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the snow. But the road was empty, the cabin shrinking into the distance. I never returned. The novel remained unfinished, and I avoided the woods after that. But on winter nights, when the wind howls and the snow falls heavy, I sometimes hear her voice in my dreams, whispering the same words: "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 9.
The snowstorm had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, the sky was clear and the roads were passable, and the next, the world outside was consumed by a wall of white. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, let alone the road that led to the small cabin I was renting for the weekend. My car's headlights cut through the snow, but they barely illuminated the path ahead of me. I had come up to the mountains to get away from the noise of the city, to have a quiet weekend to myself. The cabin I'd rented was isolated, sitting in the middle of a dense forest. It was supposed to be peaceful, just what I needed to clear my head. But the storm was relentless, and I wasn't sure if I'd made a mistake by coming up here in such bad weather. I pulled the car into the long driveway, which was now buried under a thick blanket of snow. I got out, gripping the door handle with a tight fist to keep from being blown away by the wind. My boots sunk into the snow as I made my way to the cabin's front door, where I fumbled with the keys before I managed to unlock it. Inside, the warmth of the cabin was a welcome relief from the freezing wind. I turned on the lights and tossed my bag onto the couch. It was an old, rustic place with wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and heavy curtains that blocked the outside world. A fire crackled in the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. I thought about going to bed early, but something in the back of my mind told me I should wait out the storm. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or the way the wind howled against the cabin, but I felt uneasy. After a while, I decided to make myself a drink and settle in with a book. The last thing I wanted was to sit in silence, alone with my thoughts. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside only grew worse. I heard the wind moan, rattling the windows as the snow continued to fall. Around midnight, I finally decided to head to bed. The wind was louder now, so loud that it almost sounded like a distant voice, faint but unmistakable. I made my way upstairs to the small bedroom at the back of the house. The bed was large and comfortable, the covers warm and inviting. As I lay there trying to sleep, I kept hearing that strange sound. It was like someone was whispering from outside the window. At first, I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the longer I listened, the more convinced I became that it was something else. I pulled the covers up over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ignore it. But then, the whispering grew louder, clearer, almost as if it were right outside the room. I could hear faint words, unintelligible at first, but unmistakably human. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room was dark, except for the small glow from the fire downstairs, casting a dim light through the cracks in the floorboards. I couldn't tell if the whispers were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. I had to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and stood, my legs trembling. The wind howled louder outside as I made my way down the stairs. The house seemed eerily quiet now, as if something had changed. The whispering was gone, replaced by an unnerving silence that filled the space like a heavy blanket. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around the room. The fire in the fireplace had dwindled down to a faint glow, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the windows. The wind continued to rage outside, but it felt like the house was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a shadow, standing near the window, faint but unmistakable. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was a figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. The figure stood still, facing the window, as if it were waiting for something. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge me. It just stood there, as still as a statue, its form nearly blending into the shadows of the room. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find the strength. I had to know what it was. Slowly, I took a step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure remained motionless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me, that it was waiting for me to come closer. I shone the flashlight on the figure, but it didn't cast any light on it. It was as though the light passed right through it, like it wasn't there at all. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Just then, the figure turned its head toward me. Its face was a blur, as if it had no features, no eyes, no nose, just a dark void where its face should have been. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as the figure began to move toward me, its steps slow but deliberate. I backed up, tripping over my own feet, but the figure was already too close. I could feel its presence, a cold, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The whispering returned, faint but clear, and I could hear words now, words that I couldn't fully understand, but they sounded like a plea, like a desperate cry for help. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and ran, not even thinking, just trying to escape. I darted back up the stairs, hearing the footsteps behind me, slow but persistent, echoing in the empty house. I reached my room and slammed the door behind me, pressing my back against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering stopped. For a long time, I sat in the darkness, too terrified to move. I didn't know what I had seen or heard, but I knew I wasn't alone in that cabin anymore. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. I finally gathered the courage to peek through the crack in the door. The house was still, eerily so, but the figure was gone. I didn't dare go downstairs to check, didn't even want to move from the safety of my room. The storm raged through the night, but I stayed awake, listening for any sign that the figure was still there. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the walls made me jump. But I never saw it again, never heard the whispers again. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. I left the cabin as soon as I could, not looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I wasn't sure they would believe me. I didn't even know if I believed it myself. But sometimes, when the wind howls late at night, I can still hear those whispers. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The winter night was still, the kind of stillness that feels alive, pressing against your ears. Snow blanketed the landscape, shimmering faintly under the glow of the moon. I was driving to my sister's new house in the countryside, a surprise visit to celebrate her birthday. It had been years since we'd spent one together, and despite the weather warnings, I thought I could make the trip. The road was narrow, flanked by dense trees that bent under the weight of the snow. My car's headlights barely cut through the darkness, and I cursed myself for leaving late. The GPS told me I was only 30 minutes away, but out here, 30 minutes felt like an eternity. The first sign of trouble came when the radio cut out. Static filled the cabin, a harsh, grating sound that made me wince. I turned it off, but the silence that followed was even worse. Then, as if on cue, the engine sputtered. The car slowed, jerking slightly before coming to a complete stop. I tried restarting it, but the engine only groaned in protest. Great. I muttered, slamming my hands against the steering wheel. I grabbed my phone, only to find that I had no signal. The storm clouds had rolled in thick and heavy, and the snow was coming down harder now. I couldn't stay in the car. It was already freezing inside. I pulled on my coat and stepped out, the cold biting at my skin. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a strange, high-pitched whistling sound. I looked around, but there was nothing, just an endless expanse of snow and trees. I decided to walk back to the last house I'd passed. It had been a couple of miles back, but I remembered the faint glow of its lights through the trees. With no other options, I started walking, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees growing taller and more imposing. The wind carried strange noises, branches snapping, whispers that seemed just out of earshot. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After what felt like an hour, I finally saw it. The house. It was old, with a sagging roof and broken shutters. The light I had seen was faint now, flickering like a dying candle. I hesitated. Something about the house felt wrong, but the cold was unbearable, and I didn't have a choice. I knocked on the door, my gloved hand making a dull thud against the wood. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open slightly, and I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp on a wooden table. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic like rust. The walls were lined with old photographs, their faces faded and smudged. A cold draft swept through the room, and I shivered, shutting the door behind me. "Hello?" I called again, my voice echoing slightly. Still, no answer. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing on the creaky floorboards. The furniture was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if no one had lived here for years. And yet, the lamp was lit. I stopped in the living room, where an old armchair faced a cold, blackened fireplace. Something about the chair made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. I turned away, but then I heard it, a soft, low creak. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned back. The chair had moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, but it had definitely moved. I stared at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, from upstairs, I heard a loud thump. "Hello?" I said again, my voice trembling. The sound didn't come again, but I could feel it. Someone or something was up there. Against every instinct, I climbed the staircase, the wood groaning under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and shadowy. There were 4 doors, all closed except for one at the far end. Pale moonlight spilled out from it, illuminating the floor. I walked toward the open door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached it, I peeked inside. The room was empty, except for a bed pushed against the far wall. On the bed sat a doll, an old, porcelain doll with cracked cheeks and empty eyes. Its head was tilted to one side, as if it were watching me. The air in the room felt wrong, thick and suffocating. I stepped back, my foot catching on something. I stumbled, and when I turned to look, I saw a smear of red on the floor, fresh blood leading from the doorway to the next room. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Slowly, I followed the trail, my boots leaving faint impressions in the blood-streaked floor. I pushed open the next door, my heart hammering in my chest. Inside, the walls were covered in writing, words scrawled in a dark, dripping substance. "Leave," they said. "Get out." In the center of the room stood a figure, hunched and shrouded in shadow. Its head snapped toward me, and I saw its eyes, dark, hollow voids that seemed to pull me in. It opened its mouth, and a sound came out, a guttural, inhuman wail that shook me to my core. I turned and ran, the house seeming to twist and shift around me. The staircase was longer now, the walls closing in. The whispers in the wind were louder, more urgent. "Leave," they said. "Leave now." I burst through the front door and into the freezing night, the cold air searing my lungs. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that house. The snow was deeper now, and I stumbled, falling face first into the icy ground. When I looked up, the house was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, the snow undisturbed. My car was a few feet away, its headlights dim but still on. I climbed in, my hands shaking as I started the engine. This time it roared to life, and I sped down the road, not daring to look back. When I finally reached my sister's house, she greeted me with a worried expression. "You're late," she said. I was starting to worry. I didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't have the words. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the high-pitched whistling of the wind, carrying with it a single, chilling whisper. Leave. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The snowstorm had rolled in faster than expected, blanketing the small mountain town of Gray Hollow in a thick, icy veil. The roads were treacherous, visibility reduced to a few feet ahead. Most of the townsfolk had retreated to their homes, their chimneys puffing steady streams of smoke into the frigid air. Ben and Clara Montgomery, a young couple who had recently moved into an old creaky cabin on the outskirts of town, were among the few caught unprepared. They'd spent the day hiking through the nearby trails, enjoying the winter landscape, and hadn't noticed the storm until it was nearly upon them. By the time they made it back to the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the storm's icy fingers clawed at the windows with relentless determination. The cabin was a relic, one of the oldest buildings in Gray Hollow. It had belonged to a trapper in the 1800s, a man whose name had long since been forgotten, but whose legacy of creaks, groans, and drafts lived on. The townsfolk warned the Montgomerys about the place, telling them it had a history, but the couple had laughed it off, drawn to the cabin's rustic charm and isolation. That night, as the wind howled and the snow piled high against the windows, Ben and Clara settled in by the fireplace, mugs of hot cocoa in hand. The fire crackled, its warmth a welcome contrast to the storm outside. "You know," Clara said, her voice light but tinged with curiosity, "the realtor mentioned something about this place being haunted. Did you ever look into it?" Ben chuckled, shaking his head. "Nope. Let me guess. Another tragic love story? Or maybe some old hermit's ghost looking for his gold stash?" Clara smirked. "Something like that. Apparently, the original owner disappeared during a storm like this. They found his traps, his sled, but no sign of him. Some people say he froze to death, and his spirit never left." Ben leaned back in his chair, raising an eyebrow. "Well, if he's still here, I hope he appreciates central heating and indoor plumbing." They both laughed, but their mirth was short-lived. A sharp, loud thud echoed through the cabin, startling them both. Clara's mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Ben stood, his jaw tightening. "Probably just a branch hitting the roof," he said, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the front door. "I'll check it out." Clara grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy? It's a blizzard out there." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll check the inside first." He began walking through the cabin, shining the flashlight into every corner. The beams of light illuminated the old wooden beams, the antique furniture, and the dust motes swirling in the air. Everything seemed normal, but the sense of unease lingered. "See? Nothing to worry about," Ben said as he returned to the living room. But as he spoke, the sound came again. This time it was louder and more distinct, a rhythmic pounding like fists striking wood. It was coming from the back door. Clara clutched a blanket tightly around her shoulders. "Ben, don't!" He held up a hand to calm her, though his own nerves were fraying. Slowly, he approached the back door, the flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. The pounding continued, steady and insistent. "Hello?" He called out, his voice strong despite the fear tightening his chest. "Who's there?" The pounding stopped. Ben froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. Clara stood behind him, holding her breath. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside, and then from the other side of the door came a voice, a low, raspy whisper. "Let me in." Ben's blood ran cold. He stepped back, shaking his head. "Who are you?" he demanded. The whisper came again, louder this time. "It's cold. Let me in." Clara grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't open it, Ben," he nodded, stepping back farther. "Go away," he shouted. "You're not coming in." Silence fell, thick and suffocating. The pounding stopped, and for a moment it seemed like whoever or whatever was outside had gone. But then the whisper came again, this time from the living room. "I'm already here." Clara screamed, spinning around. The fire in the hearth flared violently, casting eerie shadows across the walls. For a split second, they saw it, a figure standing near the window. Its form was indistinct, as if it were made of smoke, but its eyes burned like embers. The figure raised a hand, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep across the windows, the walls, even the floor. Clara and Ben backed away, like their breaths visible in the freezing air. "What do you want?" Clara cried, her voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved closer, gliding across the floor with an unnatural grace. The whispering began again, a cacophony of voices overlapping, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Ben grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the front door. "We have to get out of here." But as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire cabin. The figure was suddenly in front of them, blocking their path. Its burning eyes bore into theirs, and for a moment everything was silent. Then it spoke, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "This is my home." The cabin shuddered, the old wooden beams groaning as if under immense pressure. The frost thickened, spreading across the walls and ceiling, encasing the cabin in a layer of ice. Ben and Clara huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the temperature continued to drop. The figure loomed over them, its smoky form twisting and writhing like a living shadow. "Leave," it growled, its voice echoing in their minds. "We can't," Clara whimpered. "The storm." The figure leaned closer, its face inches from hers. "Then stay," it whispered. "Stay forever." The lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the figure's glowing eyes and the faint, dying embers in the fireplace. Ben reached out blindly, fumbling for anything he could use to defend them, but his hands found nothing but icy air. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The figure disappeared, and the frost began to melt. The fire in the hearth roared back to life, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. Ben and Clara sat frozen in place, their breaths shallow and their hearts pounding. The cabin was silent once more, the storm outside seeming distant and unthreatening in comparison. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they huddled together by the fire, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the windows, they packed their belongings and left the cabin without looking back. The townsfolk weren't surprised when they returned, pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what had happened. No one ever stayed in that cabin for long, and no one ever found out what truly happened to the trapper who disappeared on a winter night so many years ago. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The winter night was unforgiving, cold and sharp as broken glass. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the roads in a slick, treacherous layer. I regretted taking the detour through the back roads, but the GPS had promised it was a shortcut. I was eager to get to my parents' cabin, tucked deep in the woods, where the fireplace and a hot cup of cocoa waited. It was nearly midnight, and the only sound was the steady thrum of my tires against the snow-packed road. The forest on either side of me was a wall of blackness, broken only by the weak glow of my headlights. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and the isolation was starting to press down on me. That's when I saw her, a figure in white, standing by the side of the road. She wore no coat, no gloves, just a thin white dress that whipped around her legs in the icy wind. Her long hair was tangled, her face pale and sharp as bone. She raised her hand as I approached, a silent plea. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to keep driving, but she looked so out of place, so vulnerable in the cold. I slowed to a stop, rolling down the passenger side window just a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out. My breath clouded in the frigid air. Her lips didn't move, but I heard her voice clearly, as if she were standing right beside me. "I need help, please." Her eyes, dark, hollow, met mine. There was something unsettling about her gaze, but guilt gnawed at me. I couldn't just leave her there. "Get in," I said reluctantly, unlocking the door. She slid into the seat, her body stiff and cold. The temperature in the car seemed to drop as soon as she closed the door. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. She turned to me, her eyes unreadable. "Just a little further down the road." I nodded, gripping the wheel tightly as I pulled back onto the snowy road. The silence between us was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the heater. She didn't shiver or rub her hands together like someone trying to warm up. She just sat there, still as stone, staring straight ahead. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "It's dangerous to be out here in this weather. What were you doing?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant. almost dreamlike. I was waiting. For what? For someone to stop. Her answer sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't explain why. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel her gaze on me, heavy and unblinking. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The forest seemed darker now, the trees taller and more twisted. My headlights barely seemed to penetrate the gloom. Here, she said suddenly, pointing ahead. I slowed down. There was nothing but an overgrown path leading into the woods. You want me to stop here? I asked, incredulous. Yes, she said. Her voice was firmer now, the Zach more insistent. I pulled over, but I didn't turn off the engine. Something about this didn't feel right. She opened the door and stepped out, her bare feet sinking into the snow. Wait, I called after her. Are you sure you're okay? Do you need me to call someone? She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. Thank you for stopping. And then she walked into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to follow her. But the forest looked impenetrable, and a deep unease had settled in my chest. I decided to keep driving, convincing myself that she must have known where she was going. I was about to pull back onto the road when I noticed something on the passenger seat. A faint, wet imprint, like someone had been sitting there even though it was completely dry when she got out. A chill ran down my spine. My hands tightened on the wheel and I sped away, the trees closing in around me like dark sentinels. The cabin came into view an hour later, its warm lights a beacon of safety. I stumbled inside, desperate to shake off the lingering unease. My parents were asleep, so I made myself a cup of tea and tried to calm down. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she? Why had she been out there? Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my laptop and searched for anything about the area where I'd picked her up. It didn't take long to find a story, a chilling one. 20 years ago, a young woman named Clara had gone missing in those woods during a snowstorm. She was last seen walking along the same stretch of road where I'd picked up the stranger. Her body was found weeks later, frozen and alone, not far from the overgrown path she had led me to. The article included a photo of her. My heart stopped. It was her. The same pale face, the same dark eyes. I shut the laptop, my hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. I could still feel her presence, lingering like a frost that wouldn't thaw. That night, I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed of the woods, of her voice calling out to me, softer now, but no less haunting. Thank you for stopping, she whispered. I never took that road again. But every winter, when the snow falls heavy and the nights stretch long, I think of her. Somewhere out there, she's still waiting, her hollow eyes scanning the road for someone to stop. Story the end.
Story number 13.
The winter night had settled over the small rural town of Dunwich like a heavy blanket, suffocating the world in a deep, eerie silence. The snowstorm had started earlier that afternoon, its ferocity growing as darkness fell. By the time the last light faded from the horizon, the wind was howling through the trees, rattling windows and piling snow against doors. It was the kind of storm that kept people indoors, huddled by their fireplaces, hoping for morning. Eleanor Harper didn't have the luxury of waiting out the storm. She had taken the late shift at the Dunwich Inn, the only motel in town, and now she was trudging back home through the snow. The inn was only a mile from her house, but the journey felt endless in the blizzard. The wind clawed at her coat, and the snow stung her cheeks like tiny needles. Her flashlight barely cut through the swirling white. The world around her was a blur of shadows and shifting shapes, her own footsteps muffled by the thick snow. She regretted not calling for a ride, but her phone had no signal, and the roads were impassable. She told herself she'd be fine. She'd walked this route hundreds of times before. The first sign that something was wrong came when she reached the old Miller house. The dilapidated structure sat just off the road, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. No one had lived there for decades, not since the Millers had vanished one winter night long ago. Locals avoided the place, calling it cursed, but Eleanor had always dismissed the stories as small-town superstition. As she passed the house, a faint sound reached her ears, barely audible over the wind. It was a soft, rhythmic creaking, like a rocking chair, moving back and forth. She stopped, her breath fogging the air in front of her. The sound didn't stop. It was coming from the porch. She turned her flashlight toward the house. The beam illuminated the sagging porch and the boarded-up windows, but nothing else. The rocking chair that had once sat there was long gone, the wood of the porch half rotted and covered in snow. And yet, the sound continued. Eleanor's heart began to pound. She told herself it was just the wind, that the boards were shifting under the pressure of the storm. Still, she quickened her pace, eager to put the house behind her. She had barely gone 20 steps when she heard it again, this time closer. The creaking was accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. She froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she scanned the empty road. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. The wind howled around her, the snow swirling in chaotic patterns, but the road remained empty. She was alone, or so she thought. Eleanor forced herself to keep walking, her boots crunching in the snow. She focused on the path ahead, determined to make it home as quickly as possible. But the unease clung to her, an invisible weight pressing on her chest. As she neared the old stone bridge that marked the halfway point to her house, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, clearer, and unmistakably coming from behind her. She turned sharply, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. The beam landed on the snow-covered road, her tracks the only disturbance in the pristine white. But just beyond her tracks, in the untouched snow, another set of footprints began to form. They appeared one by one, each step pressing into the snow as if an invisible figure were walking toward her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. The footprints were deliberate, slow, and unyielding, leaving no doubt that someone was there. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Show yourself." The footprints stopped. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind dying down to an unnatural stillness. And then, just beyond the edge of her flashlight's beam, a figure emerged. It was tall and shrouded in shadows, its features indistinct. The only thing Eleanor could see clearly were its eyes, two pinpricks of light like distant stars, burning cold and unfeeling. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at her. Eleanor didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, her feet slipping and sliding in the snow. The whispers rose around her, a cacophony of voices overlapping, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. She didn't dare look back. The bridge loomed ahead, its stone arch barely visible through the storm. She reached it, her lungs burning and her legs screaming for rest. As she crossed, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the air itself were pressing down on her. When she reached the other side, she stopped, turning to see if the figure had followed. The road behind her was empty, the snow pristine except for her own tracks. The whispers had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. She allowed herself a moment to catch her breath, her relief short-lived. She was about to continue when she noticed something strange. The snow on the bridge had changed. Her footprints, which should have been visible, were gone. In their place were dozens of other tracks, small, bare footprints like those of children. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She stepped back, her mind racing. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder until they were deafening. She turned and ran again, the bridge and its haunting tracks disappearing behind her. When she finally reached her house, she threw open the door and slammed it shut, locking it and pushing the deadbolt into place. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving and her heart racing. The house was dark, but it felt safe, a sanctuary from whatever was out there. She flipped on every light, making sure the windows and doors were secure. She tried to call someone, anyone, but her phone still had no signal. Eleanor spent the night huddled in the living room, a fire roaring in the hearth, and a knife clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't sleep. The whispers never came inside, but they lingered outside, faint and relentless, until the first light of dawn broke through the storm. When the sun rose, the whispers disappeared, leaving only an unsettling silence in their wake. Eleanor stepped outside, her breath visible in the icy air. The storm had passed, the snow glistening under the morning light. But the footprints were still there, leading from the bridge to her front door. Story the end.